Hi everyone, I hope you're all having a good day. I'm out here again on my front balcony with my friend Stanley, here to come at you with another book from the Flat Stanley series. This one is called Invisible Stanley, and I actually haven't read this one yet, so it's going to be a lot of fun to read along with you for the first time, and I know it's going to be a really good one. And so let's just get started. It is raining a little bit right now, so I hope that's not too distracting, but without further ado, let's begin. This is the prologue. Here's the picture. It says, Stanley Lambchop spoke into the darkness above his bed. I can't sleep. It's the rain, I think. There was no response from the bed across the room. I'm hungry too, Stanley said. Are you awake, Arthur? I am now, said his younger brother. You woke me. Stanley fetched an apple from the kitchen and ate it by the bedroom window. The rain worsened. I'm still hungry, he said. Raisins, shelf, murmured Arthur, half asleep again. Crash came thunder. Lightning flashed. Stanley found a little box of raisins on the shelf by the window. He ate one. Crash, flash. Stanley ate more raisins. Crash, flash. Arthur yawned. Go to bed. You can't be hungry still. I'm not, actually. Stanley got back into bed, but I feel sort of, different, I guess. He slept. Chapter 1. Where is Stanley? Breakfast is ready, George. We must wake the boys, Miss Lambchop said to her husband. Just then, Arthur Lambchop called from the bedroom he shared with his brother. Hey, come here, hey. Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop smiled, recalling another morning that had begun like this. An enormous bulletin board, they discovered, had fallen on Stanley during the night, leaving him unhurt but no more than half an inch thick, and so he had remained until Arthur blew him round again, weeks later, with a bicycle pump. Hey! The call came again. Are you coming? Hey! Miss Lambchop held firm views about good manners and correct speech. Hay is for horses, not people, Arthur, she said as they entered the bedroom. As well you know. Excuse me, said Arthur. The thing is, I can hear Stanley, but I can't find him. Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop looked at the room. A shape was visible beneath the covers of Stanley's bed, and the pillow was squashed down as if a head rested upon it, but there was no head. Why are you staring? The voice was Stanley's. Smiling, Mr. Lambchop looked under the bed, but saw only a pair of slippers and an old tennis ball. Not here, he said. Arthur put out a hand, exploring. Ouch, said Stanley's voice. You poked my nose. Arthur gasped. Miss Lambchop stepped forward. If I may. Gently, using both hands, she felt about. A giggle rose from the bed. That tickles. Oh my, said Miss Lambchop. She looked at Mr. Lambchop and he looked at her, as they had in the past during great surprises. Stanley's flatness had been the first of these. Another had come the evening that they discovered a young genie, Prince Heraz, in the bedroom with Stanley and Arthur, who had accidentally summoned him from a lamp. Miss Lambchop drew a deep breath. We must face facts, George. Stanley is now invisible. You're right, said a startled voice from the bed. I can't see my feet, or my pajamas. Darnest thing I've ever seen, said Mr. Lambchop, or not seen, I should say. Try some other pajamas, Stanley. Stanley got out of bed and put on a different pair of pajamas. But these too vanished, reappearing only when he took them off. It was the same for the shirt and the trousers he tried on next. Gracious, Miss Lambchop shook her head. How are we to keep track of you, dear? I know, said Arthur, untying a small red balloon, a party favor that floated above his bed. He gave Stanley the string to hold. Try this, he said. The string vanished, but not the balloon. There, said Miss Lambchop, at least we can tell approximately where Stanley is. Now let's all have breakfast. Then, George, we must see what Dr. Dan makes of this. Chapter 2. Dr. Dan. What's that red balloon doing here? Asked Dr. Dan. Well, never mind. Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop. Something about Stanley, my nurse says. He's not been taken flat again. No, no, said Miss Lambchop. Stanley has remained round. They mostly do, said Dr. Dan. Well, let's have the little fellow in. picture. See, there's the balloon, but no Stanley. I am in, said Stanley, standing directly before him, holding the balloon. Ha ha, Mr. Lambchop, said Dr. Dan. You are an excellent ventriloquist, but I see through your little joke. What you see through, said Mr. Lambchop, is Stanley. Beg your pardon, said Dr. Dan. Stanley became invisible during the night, Miss Lambchop explained. We are quite unsettled by it. Headache? Dr. Dan asked Stanley's balloon. Throat sore? Stomach upset? I feel fine, Stanley said. I see. Dr. Dan shook his head. Frankly, despite my long years of practice, I've not run into this before, but one of my excellent medical books, Difficult and Peculiar Cases by Dr. Franz Meister, may help. He took a large book from the shelf behind him and looked at it. Ah, disappearances, page 134. He found the page. Not much here, I'm afraid. France, 1851, a Madame Poulenc vanished while eating bananas in the rain. Spain, 1923, the Gonzalez twins, age 11, became invisible after eating fruit salad. Lightning had been observed. The most recent case in 1968 is Umbuk, an Eskimo chief last seen eating canned peaches during a blizzard. Dr. Dan returned the book to the shelf. That's it, he said. Jim Meister suspects a connection between the bad weather and fruit. It stormed last night, said Stanley, and I ate an apple. Raisins, too. There you are, said Dr. Dan, but we must look on the bright side, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop. Stanley seems perfectly healthy, except for the visibility factor. We'll just keep an eye on him. Easier said than done, said Mr. Lambchop. Why do his clothes also disappear? Not my field, I'm afraid, said Dr. Dan. I suggest a textile specialist. We've kept you long enough, Doctor, Miss Lambchop said. Come, George. Stanley, where are you? Stanley? Ah, just hold the balloon a bit higher, dear. Goodbye, Dr. Dan. By dinner time, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop and Arthur had become quite sad. The red balloon, though useful in locating Stanley, kept reminding them of how much they missed his dear face and smile. But after dinner, Mrs. Lambchop, who was artistically talented, replaced the red balloon with a white one and got out her watercolor paints. Using 4 colors and several delicate brushes, she painted an excellent likeness of Stanley smiling on the white balloon. Everyone became at once more cheerful. Stanley said he felt almost his old self again, especially when he looked in the mirror. Chapter 3. The First Days. The next morning, Mrs. Lambchop wrote a note to Stanley's teacher, tied a stronger string to his balloon, and sent him off to school. Dear Miss Benchley, the note said, Stanley has unexpectedly become invisible. You will find the balloon a useful guide to his presence. Sincerely, Harriet Lambchop. So there he is walking to school with his brother. Miss Benchley spoke to the class. We must not stare at where we suppose Stanley to be, she said, or gossip about his state. Nevertheless, word soon reached the newspaper. A reporter visited the school and the story appeared the next day. The headline read, Smiling student, once you saw him, now you don't. Beneath it were 2 photographs, a before and after. The before, taken by Miss Benchley a week earlier, showed a smiling Stanley at his desk. The after, taken by the reporter, showed only Stanley's desk and his smiley-faced balloon bobbing above it. The story included a statement by Miss Benchley that Stanley was in fact at the desk and, to the best of her knowledge, smiling. Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop bought several copies of the paper for out-of-town friends. Her colorful balloon artwork lost something in black and white, Miss Lambchop said, but on the whole it had photographed well. Arthur said that Invisible's boy brother would have been an interesting picture and that Stanley should suggest it if the reporter ever came around. Now you see him, now you don't. Being invisible offered temptations, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop warned, but Stanley must resist them. It would be wrong to spy on people, for example, or sneak up on them to hear what they were saying. But the next Saturday afternoon, when the Lambchops went to the movies, it was Arthur who could not resist. Don't buy a seat for Stanley, he whispered at the ticket window. Just hide his balloon. Who would know? That would be deceitful, dear, said Mrs. Lambchop. 4 seats, please, she told the ticket lady. We want one for our coats, you see. Wasn't that deceitful? Sort of? Arthur asked as they went in. Not in the same way, said Mr. Lambchop, tucking Stanley's balloon beneath his seat. Just as the film began, a very tall man sat directly in front of Stanley, blocking his view. Mr. Lambchop took Stanley on his lap, from which the screen was easily seen, and the people farther back saw right through him without even knowing it. Stanley greatly enjoyed the show. See, said Arthur as they went out, Stanley didn't even need a seat. You have a point, said Mr. Lambchop. Those legs have gone to sleep. This is Chapter 4, In the Park. It was Sunday afternoon. Arthur had gone to visit a friend, so Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop set out with Stanley for a nearby park. The streets were crowded, and Stanley carried his balloon to lessen the risk of being jostled by people hurrying by. Near the park they met Ralph Jones, an old college friend of Mr. Lambchop's. Always a treat running into your family, George, said Mr. Jones. The older boy was flat once, I recall. You had him all rolled up. What a memory you have, said Mr. Lambchop. How are you, Ralph, said Mrs. Lambchop. Stanley, say hello to Mr. Jones. Take care, said Mr. Jones. That balloon is floating. Just where is Stanley? Holding the balloon, Stanley said. I got invisible somehow. Is that so? First flat, now invisible? Ralph Jones shook his head. Kids, always one thing or another, eh, George? My oldest needs dental work. Well, I must run. By a field in the park, the Lambchops found a bench on which to rest. On the field, children were racing bicycles, round and round. Suddenly, shouts rose. Give up, Billy. Billy's no good. Billy, silly. Silly Billy. He can't ride a bike. That must be Billy, said Mrs. Lambchop. The little fellow's so far behind the rest. Oh dear, how he teeters. Stanley remembered how nervous he had been when he was learning to ride, and how his father had steadied him. Poor Billy, if only... I'll do it, he thought, and tied his balloon to the bench. When Billy came around again, Stanley darted onto the field. Taking hold of the teetering bicycle from behind, he began to run. Uh-oh, said little Billy, surprised to be gaining speed. Stanley ran harder, keeping the bicycle steady. The pedals rose and fell, faster and faster, then faster still. Yikes, cried Billy. Stanley ran as fast as he could. Soon they passed the boy riding just ahead, and then another boy, and another. Not until they had passed the other riders did Stanley, now out of breath, let go. Whee! Billy shouted, and went round once more by himself. You win, Billy, shouted the other boys. How did you get so good? And so suddenly? You sure had us fooled. Stanley got his breath back and returned to Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop on the bench. Too bad you missed it, Stanley, said Mr. Lambchop, pretending he had not guessed the truth. That teetery little boy, he rode very well, suddenly. Oh, said Stanley, pretending also. I wasn't paying attention, I guess. Mr. Lambchop gave him a little poke in the ribs. Half an hour passed, and Mrs. Lambchop worried that they might be sitting too long in the sun. In Stanley's present state, she said, over-tanning would be difficult to detect. Just then, a young man and pretty girl strolled past, hand in hand, and halted in the grove of trees close by. That is Philip, the son of my dear friend, Mrs. Hogston, Mrs. Lambchop said. The girl must be his sweetheart, Lucia. Such a sad story. They are in love, and Philip wants very much to propose marriage, but he is too shy. He tries and tries, Miss Hogston says, but each time his courage fails, and Lucia is too timid to coax the proposal from him. Mr. Lambchop was not the least bit shy. I'll go introduce myself, he said, and popped the question for him. No, George, Miss Lambchop shook her head. Lucia must hear the words from Philip's own lips. An idea came to Stanley. Be right back, he said, and ran to the grove in which the young people stood. Once beside, he stood very still. Nice day, Lucia, you don't think? Philip was saying. Though they say it may rain, who knows? You are quite right, I'm sure, Philip, the girl replied. I do value your opinions about the weather. You are kind, very kind. Philip trembled a bit. Lucia, I want to ask, would you? Consent, that is. He gulped. What a pretty dress you have on. Thank you, said Lucia. I like your necktie. And you were saying, Philip? Ah, said Philip. Right, yes. For some time now, dear Lucia, my dearest wish. Oh my, I want... He bit his lip. Look, a dark cloud. It may rain after all. I hope not. Lucia seemed close to tears. If it rained, well, you might get wet. This is very boring, Stanley thought. The conversation grew even more boring. Again and again, Philip failed to declare his love, chattering instead about the weather, or the look of a tree, or children playing in the park. I want to ask, dear Lucia, Philip began again for perhaps the 20th time. If you will, that is, if... Yes, said Lucia, also perhaps for the 20th time. What, Philip? What do you wish to say? Stanley leaned forward. Lucia, said Philip. So there's Philip and Lucia. Marry me, said Stanley, making his voice as much like Philip's as he could. Lucia's eyes opened wide. I will, Philip, she cried. Of course I will marry you. Philip looked as if he might faint. What? Did I? You will? Lucia hugged him. I proposed at last, cried Philip. I can hardly believe I spoke the words. You didn't, Stanley thought. Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop had seen the two embrace. Well done, Stanley, they said when he returned to their bench, and several more times on the way home. Miss Hogston called that evening to report that Philip and Lucia would soon be wed. How wonderful, Miss Lambchop said. She had glimpsed them in the park just that afternoon. Such a handsome pair. So much in love. Stanley teased her. You said never to sneak up on people or spy on them, but I did today. Are you mad at me? Oh, very angry, said Miss Lambchop, and kissed the top of his head. Chapter 5, The TV Show. Arthur was feeling left out. Stanley always gets to have interesting adventures, he said, and that newspaper story was just about him. Nobody seems interested in me. The best way to draw attention, dear, said Mrs. Lambchop, is by one's character. Be kindly and fair. Cheerfulness is much admired, as is wit. I can't manage all that, said Arthur. Miss Lambchop spoke privately to Stanley. Your brother is a bit jealous, she said. When I was flat, Arthur was jealous because people stared at me, Stanley said. Now they can't see me at all, and he's jealous again? Miss Lambchop sighed. If you can find a way to cheer him, do. The very next day, an important TV person telephoned Mr. Lambchop. Teddy Talker here, Lambchop, he said, host of the enormously popular TV show, Talking with Teddy Talker. Will Stanley appear on it? It would please us to have Stanley appear anywhere at all, Mr. Lambchop said. People can't see him, you know. I'll just say he's there, said Teddy Talker. Speak to the boy. Let me know. Stanley said that he did not particularly care to go on TV, but then he remembered about cheering up Arthur. All right, he said, but Arthur too. He likes to tell jokes and do magic tricks. Say we'll both be on the show. Arthur was very pleased, and that evening, the brothers planned what they would do. The next morning, Mr. Lambchop told Teddy Talker. Excellent plan, said the TV man. This Friday, yes? Thank you, Lambchop. Welcome, everybody, said Teddy Talker that Friday evening from the stage of his TV show. Wonderful guests tonight, including an invisible boy. In the front row, applauding with the rest of the audience, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop thought of Stanley and Arthur, now waiting in a dressing room backstage. How excited they must be. The other guests were already seated on the sofa by Teddy Talker's desk. He chatted first with a lady who had written a book about sausage, next with a tennis champion who had become a rabbi, and then with a very pretty young woman who had won a beauty contest, but planned now to devote herself to the cause of world peace. At last came the announcement that began the Lambchop plan. Invisible Stanley has been delayed but will be here shortly. Teddy Talker told the audience, meanwhile, we are fortunate in having with us his very talented brother. Protests rose. Brother? A visible brother? Drat, good thing we got in free. Ladies and gentlemen, said Teddy Talker, mirth and magic with Arthur Lambchop. Arthur stepped out onto the stage wearing a smart black magician's cape Mrs. Lambchop had made for him and carrying a small box, which he placed on Teddy Talker's desk. Hello, everybody, he said. The box is for later. Now let's have fun. Heard the story about the 3 holes in the ground? He waited, smiling. Well, well, well. 2 people laughed, but that was all. I don't understand, said the lady sitting behind Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop. Mr. Lambchop turned around in his seat. A well is a hole in the ground. He said, well, 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 3 holes? Ah, I see, said the lady. A riddle, ladies and gentlemen, cried Arthur. Where do kings keep their armies? Where? Someone called. In their sleeveys, said Arthur. Many people laughed now. including the lady who had missed the first joke. I got that one, she said. A mind-reading trick, Arthur announced. He shuffled a deck of cards and let Teddy Talker draw one. Don't let me see it, he said, but look at it. Picture it in your mind. I will concentrate, using my magic powers. Arthur closed his eyes. Your card is, sir, is the Four of Hearts. It is, cried Teddy Talker. It is the Four of Hearts. Voices rose again. Incredible! He can read minds. So young, too. Do that one again, lad. Certainly, said Arthur, but he had used a false deck in which every card was the Four of Hearts, and the audience would surely guess if that card was named again. Fortunately, the brothers had thought of this. Backstage, Stanley tied his balloon to a chair. Arthur now shuffled a real deck of cards, then called for a volunteer. When an elderly gentleman came up onto the stage, Stanley tiptoed out to stand behind him. The audience applauded the volunteer. How peculiar this is, Stanley thought. Hundreds of people looking, but no one can see me. Draw a card, sir, said Arthur. Thank you. Keep it hidden, but picture it in your mind. Again, closing his eyes, he pretended to be thinking hard. A quick peek showed Stanley that the volunteer had held the 10 of clubs. He tiptoed over to whisper in his brother's ear. Arthur opened his eyes. I have it. The card is the 10 of clubs. Yes! Bravo! Cried the old gentleman. The audience clapped hard as he returned to his seat. Mr. Lambchop smiled at the lady behind him. Our son, he said. So clever, said the lady. What will he do next? Miss Lambchop drew a deep breath. That morning, Stanley and Arthur had borrowed a pet frog from the boy next door. What came next, she knew, would be the most daring part of the evening's plans. Ladies and gentlemen, said Arthur, a new kind of magic. Arthur Lambchop, that's me, and Henry, the air-dancing frog. He lifted Henry from the box on Teddy Talker's desk and held him up. Henry, who appeared to be smiling, wore a little white shirt with an H on it, also made by Mrs. Lambchop. Fly, Henry, cried Arthur. Fly out and stand still in the air. Stepping forward, Stanley took Henry from Arthur's hands and ran to the far side of the stage. There he stopped, holding the frog high above his head. Henry wriggled his legs. Amazing, shouted the audience. Who'd believe it? That's some frog. What keeps him up there? Circle, Henry, Arthur commanded. Circle in the air. Stanley walked rapidly in circles, swaying Henry as he went. The audience was tremendously impressed. What a fine magician! Mind reading and frog flying. You don't see that every day. Pretending to control Henry's flight, Arthur kept a finger pointed as Stanley swooped the frog all about the stage. Whoops! Cried Teddy Walker as Henry flew above his desk. On the long sofa, the sausage writer and tennis rabbi and the beauty contest winner ducked down. Even Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop, who knew the secret of Henry's flight, thought it was an amazing sight. At last, to great applause, Arthur took Henry into his own hands and returned him to the little box. Stanley tiptoed off to get his smiley-faced balloon. The plan now called for Teddy Talker to announce the arrival of the invisible boy and introduce him, but Arthur had stepped forward again. Thank you for cheering me, he told the audience, but I have to say something. That first mind-reading trick, I really did do that one, but the second trick, actually, I can't read minds at all, and the flying frog, voices rose. Can't read minds? We've been lied to? The frog was lying? Not the frog, silly. Wait, he's not done. Please listen, said Arthur. I wouldn't be fair to me to think I did everything by myself. I had a helper. For the second trick, he saw the card and told me what it was. And Henry, well, my brother was whooshing him around in the air. By now the audience was terribly confused. Who? What helper? It was just a regular frog? But some frogs fly. No, squirrels, not frogs. Whooshing? Arthur went on. My brother Stanley helped me. He fixed it for me to be on this show. He's a really nice brother, and I thank him a lot. Teddy Talker had sprung to his feet. Ladies and gentlemen, may I now present a very special guest, who has been here all along, the invisible boy, Stanley Lambchop. Stanley came onto the stage, carrying his smiley-faced balloon. Arthur put out his hand, and the audience could tell that Stanley had taken it. There was a tremendous applause. The brothers bowed again and again, Stanley's balloon bobbing up and down. Arthur's smile was plain to see, and Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop, as they applauded, thought that even the balloon's painted smile seemed brighter than before. I have 2 children myself, said the lady behind them, both entirely visible and without theatrical flair. We are a very usual family. As are we, said Mr. Lambchop, smiling. Mostly, that is. Arthur left the stage, and Stanley sat on the sofa between the sausage rider and the beauty contest winner and answered Teddy Talker's questions. He had no idea how he became invisible, he said, and it wasn't actually a great treat being that way, since he often got bumped into and had to keep reminding people he was there. After that, Teddy Talker thanked everyone for coming, and the show was over. Back home, Arthur felt that evening had gone well. I got lots of applause, he said, but maybe it was mostly because of what Stanley did. I shouldn't be too proud, I guess. Poise and good humor contribute greatly to a performer's success, said Mrs. Lambchop. You did well on both counts. Return Henry in the morning, dear. Time now for bed. Chapter 6. The Bank Robbers. Mr. Lambchop and Stanley and Arthur were watching the evening news on TV. More dreadful scandal and violence tomorrow, said the newscaster, ending a report on national affairs. Here, in our fair city, another bank was robbed today, the third this month. The unusual robbers. Enough of crime, bustling in, Miss Lambchop switched off the TV. Come to dinner. Stanley supposed he would never know how the robbers were unusual. But the next afternoon, while strolling with his father, he found out. On the way home, they passed a bank. I must cash a check, but it's very crowded in there, said Mr. Lambchop. Wait here, Stanley. Stanley waited. Suddenly, cries rose from within the bank. Lady bank robbers, just as they said on TV. I laughed when I heard it. Me too. Two women in dresses and fancy hats, one stout and the other very tall, ran out to the bank, each with a money bag in one hand. Stay in there, the stout woman called back to the bank, her voice high and scratchy. Don't anyone run out, or else. Right, shouted the tall woman, also in an odd, high voice. Just because we are female doesn't mean we can't do this. Being invisible won't protect me, Stanley thought. He looked for a place to hide. An empty Yum Yum ice cream van was parked close by, and he jumped into it. His balloon still floated outside the van. Its strings caught in the door, but he did not dare to rescue it. Scrunching down beside the cardboard barrels marked Chocolate Yum, Strawberry Yum, and Yum Crunch, he peeked out. An alarm was ringing inside the bank, and shouts rose again. Ha! Now you're in trouble. The police will come. Put that money back where you found it, ladies. Then Stanley saw that the robber women were running toward him, carrying the money bags. They were stopping. They were getting into the Yum Yum van. Crunching down again, he held his breath. The robbers were in the van now, close to where he hid. Hurry up, said the stout woman in a surprisingly deep voice. These shoes are killing me. The tall woman opened the Yum Crunch barrel, and Stanley saw that it was empty. Then both robbers poured packets of money from their bags into the barrel and put the lid back on. Stanley could hardly believe what he saw next. The robbers threw aside their fancy hats and tugged off wigs, and now they were undressing, pulling their dresses over their heads. They were men, Stanley realized, not women. Yes, underneath the dresses they wore white ice cream man pants with the legs rolled up, and white Yum Yum shirts. Whew, what a relief, Howard. The stout robber kicked off the woman's shoes and put on white sneakers. They'll never catch us now, Ralph, said the tall one. The robbers unrolled their trouser legs and threw the female clothing into another empty barrel, the one marked Chocolate Yum. Then they jumped into the front seats, the tall man driving, and the van sped off. Behind the barrel, Stanley held his breath again. This pair was too clever to be caught. They were sure to get away. No one would suspect two Yum Yum men of being the lady, but the van was slowing. It was stopping. Stanley peeked out again. A police car blocked the road, and two policemen stood beside it, inspecting cars as they passed by. In a moment, they were at the Yum Yum van. A bank got robbed, the first policeman told the driver, by two women. You ice cream fellows seen any suspicious-looking females? My, the tall man shook his head. More and more these days, women are filling roles once played by men. Bless 'em, I say. Beside him, the stout man said hastily, but bank robbing, Howard, that's wrong. The second policeman looked into the back of the van. Just ice cream here, he told his partner. The trickery is working, Stanley thought. How can I? An idea came to him. Reaching out, he flipped the lid off the Chocolate Yum barrel. Loose lid, said the second policeman. Better tighten. Hey, this barrel is full of female clothes. Oh, the tall robber made a sad face. Those are donations, he said. They were my late mother's. Stanley flipped the lid off the Yum Crunch barrel, and the packets of money were plain to see. Your mother was a mighty rich woman, shouted the first policeman. Hands up, you two. As the robbers were being handcuffed, another police car drove up. Mr. Lambchop jumped out of it. "That balloon! On that van!" he shouted. "We've been following it. Stanley, are you in there?" "Yes," Stanley called back. "I'm fine. The bank robbers are caught. They weren't ladies at all, just dressed that way." The handcuffed robbers were dreadfully confused. "Who's yelling in our van? Who stuck a balloon in the door? Have we gone crazy?" they asked. "It's my son Stanley," said Mr. Lambchop. "He is invisible, unfortunately. Thank goodness he was not hurt." "That must be the same invisible boy they had on TV," said the first policeman. "An invisible boy?" the tall robber groaned. "After all my careful planning." The stout robber shrugged. "You can't think of everything, Howard. Don't blame yourself." The robbers were driven off to jail, and Stanley went home with Mr. Lambchop in a cab. Stanley had been far too brave, Mrs. Lambchop said, as she heard what he had done. "Really? Flipping those ice cream lids?" Arthur said he'd have flipped them too, if he thought of it. Chapter 7, Arthur's Storm. Stanley. Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop said good night. For a moment, the brothers lay silent in their beds. Then Arthur yawned. "Good night, Stanley. Pleasant dreams." "Pleasant dreams? Ha! Ha!" said Stanley. "Are you mad at me?" said Arthur. "I guess not. But," Stanley sighed, "the thing is, I don't want to go on being invisible. I was really scared today, and I hate carrying that balloon. But when I don't, people bump into me, and I can't see myself in the mirror, so I don't even remember how I look. It's like when I was flat. It was all right for a while, but then people laughed at me." "That's why I blew you around," Arthur said proudly. "Everyone said how smart I was." "If you're so smart, get me out of this fix." There was a little tremble in Stanley's voice. Arthur went to sit on the edge of his brother's bed. Feeling for a foot beneath the covers, he patted it. "I'm really sorry for you," he said. "I wish—" There was a knock at the door, and Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop came in. "Talking? You two? You ought to be asleep," they said. Arthur explained about Stanley's unhappiness. "There's more," Stanley said. "Twice my friends had parties and didn't invite me. They sometimes forget me even if I do keep waving that balloon." "Poor dear," Mrs. Lambchop said. "Out of sight, out of mind, as the saying goes." She went to put her arms around Stanley, but he had just sat up in the bed and she missed him. She found him and gave him a hug. "This is awful," Arthur said. "We have to do something." Mr. Lambchop shook his head. Dr. Dan knew no cure for Stanley's condition, and little about its cause except for a possible connection between bad weather and fruit. "Then I'll always be like this." Stanley's voice trembled again. "I'll get older and bigger, but no one will ever see." Arthur was thinking. Stanley did eat fruit. And there was a storm. Maybe— Wait! He explained his idea. Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop looked at each other, then at where Stanley was supposed to be, and then at each other again. "I'm not afraid," said Stanley. "Let's try." Mr. Lambchop nodded. "I see no harm in it." "Nor I," said Mrs. Lambchop. "Very well, Arthur. Let us gather what your plan requires." "Everyone ready?" said Arthur. "It has to be just the way it was the night Stanley got invisible." "I'm wearing the same blue and white striped pajamas," said Stanley, "and I have an apple and a box of raisins." "We can't make a real storm," Arthur said, "but maybe this will work." He stepped into the bathroom and ran the water in the sink and shower. "There's rain," he said, returning. "I'll be wind." Mrs. Lambchop held up a wooden spoon and a large skillet from the kitchen. "Thunder ready," she said. Mr. Lambchop showed a powerful flashlight that he had fetched from his toolkit. "Lightning ready." Stanley raised his apple. "Now?" "Go stand by the window," said Arthur. "Now let me think. It was dark. He put out the light. "Go on, eat." "Whoosh," he added, being wind. Stanley began to eat the apple. Water pattered down in the bathroom, into the sink, and from the shower into the tub. "Whoosh, whoosh," said Arthur. Mrs. Lambchop struck her skillet with a wooden spoon. The crash was much like thunder. "Lightning, please," Arthur said. Mr. Lambchop aimed his flashlight and flicked it on and off while Stanley finished the apple. "Now the raisins," said Arthur. One at a time. Whoosh! Stanley opened the little box and ate a raisin. Still whooshing, Arthur conducted as if an orchestra sat before him. His left hand signaled Mrs. Lambchop to strike the skillet. The right one, Mr. Lambchop, to flash the light. Nods told Stanley when to eat a raisin. Patter, splash went the water in the bathroom. Whoosh went Arthur. Crash went the skillet. Flash, flash went the light. If anyone should see us now, Mrs. Lambchop said softly, it would be hard put to explain. Stanley looked down at himself. It's no use, he said. I'm still invisible. Twist around, said Arthur. Maybe the noise and light have to hit you just a certain way. Twisting, Stanley ate 3 more raisins. The light flickered over him. He heard the water splashing, Arthur whooshing, the pounding of the skill with the spoon. How hard they were trying, he thought. How much he loved them all. He was still invisible. There's only 1 raisin left, he said. It's no use. Poor Stanley, cried Mrs. Lambchop. Arthur could not bear the thought of never seeing his brother again. Do the last raisin, Stanley, he said. Do it. Stanley ate the raisin and did 1 more twist. Mrs. Lambchop tapped her skillet and Mr. Lambchop flashed his light. Arthur gave a last whoosh. Nothing happened. At least I'm not hungry, Stanley said bravely. But, he put a hand on his cheek, I feel sort of tingly. Stanley, said Mrs. Lambchop, are you touching your cheek? I can see your hand, I think. And your pajamas, shouted Arthur, switching on the light. A sort of outline of Stanley Lambchop, with hazy stripes running up and down, had appeared by the window. Through stripes they could see the house next door. Suddenly the outline filled in. There stood Stanley in his striped pajamas, just as they remembered him. I can see my feet, Stanley shouted. It's me. Aye, dear, not me, said Mrs. Lambchop, before she could catch herself, then ran to hold him tight. Mr. Lambchop shook hands with Arthur, and then they all went into the bathroom to watch Stanley look at himself in the mirror. It hadn't mattered when he was invisible, Miss Lambchop said, but he was greatly in need of a haircut now. She made hot chocolate to celebrate the occasion, and Arthur's cleverness was acknowledged by all. But false storms cannot be relied upon, Mr. Lambchop said. We must think twice before eating fruit during bad weather, especially by a window. Then the brothers were tucked into bed again. Good night, said Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop, putting out the light. Good night, said Stanley and Arthur. Stanley got up and went to have another look in the bathroom mirror. Thank you, Arthur, he said, coming back. You saved me from being flat, and now you've saved me again. Oh, well, Arthur yawned. Stanley, try to stay, regular for a while. I will, said Stanley. Soon they were both asleep. And that's it. I really hope you all enjoyed this book. I liked it a lot. I thought it was pretty fun that there were a lot of references to the first book that we read. For the second time, we saw Stanley help solve a crime, which was pretty cool. And his brother helped him again for the second time to solve his problem. Last time when he was flat, his brother helped to blow him up with a bicycle pump. This time, his brother helped to remake the storm that brought Stanley back to normal. So I really liked that. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you're all staying safe and have a good rest of your day. And I'll see you next time. Bye.